Good evening, everyone. My name is John Ravenhill. I'm head of the School of Politics and International Relations in the College of Arts and Social Sciences here at ANU. It's my great pleasure this evening to welcome you on behalf of the school and also the ANU Centre for European Studies to this public lecture. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. The sinking of the Titanic was one of those epoch-defining events, similar in its impact on how people think about the world in which they live, to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the assassination of President John Kennedy. It was also unusual in the impact that it had on the English language. Those who can remember a little bit about the Greek mythology that maybe they learned at school will recall that the Titans were a family of giants, children of Uranus, that is heaven, and Gaia, depending on which part of the world you come from, that is earth, who contended for sovereignty of heaven. Hence, of course, Titanic, giant. But with the sinking of the liner on its maiden voyage, the adjective Titanic increasingly was used as a metaphor, as the Oxford English Dictionary says, quote, for a vast and supposedly indestructible organization that was fated to disaster, unquote. And it gave rise to the annoying cliche, much overused in the Australian political context, of shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. This evening, we're going to go way beyond these cliches. We were planning to ask Kate Winslet to come. However, we then realized that our very own homegrown star was available for this evening, and so we're delighted that Dr. Ben Wellings is presenting the lecture. Ben is currently Deputy Head of School of Politics and International Relations. He's been Associate Director of the Centre for European Studies and is also the convener of a new Bachelor of European Studies degree launching next year?
This year.
Oh, this year, okay. Which is an exciting development. Amongst other things, it provides opportunities for students to spend time on exchange in European universities. Ben is an expert on nationalism. His book on English nationalism and Euroscepticism was published earlier this year. Equally important for us this evening, Ben is acknowledged as one of the very best teachers on this campus. He's been a recipient of the Vice Chancellor's Award for Teaching Excellence, and last year was nominated by the Student Association to give the last lecture, an annual campus-wide event. So, with no more ado, I am very pleased to introduce in living 3D, with no extra charge for ridiculous spectacles, Dr. Ben Wellings.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming. I need to perhaps explain how I became interested in the Titanic, and there are two main reasons for this. And the first is stems from teaching contemporary European history here at the ANU, and trying to think of ways to explain Europe 100 years ago to students in a way that I hope was engaging and a little bit different to perhaps what had been offered before. The second is much more personal. I used to be a merchant seaman. Whilst I was, don't laugh, whilst I was at university as an undergraduate at the University of Sussex in Brighton, you'll know that Brighton is quite close to France, and there is a body of water between England and France. Ferries have been plying those waters for many, many centuries. My job was to keep England supplied with cheap French lager, and I think I did my bit to do that, so I'm quite proud of this. But of course, what this meant is that I kind of have, you know, I know what it's like on the inside of a ship, and I know what it's like, you know, down below the waterline where my sleeping quarters were, and I know what sort of life is like on a ship. Now, it's not the Titanic, and it's quite different technology and so on and so forth, but nevertheless, you know, there are times when I can kind of see myself in a situation a bit like the Titanic. Right? There were a few occasions where I was called to emergency stations, muster stations as they say. One of these times was when the acting purser, okay, he'd been acting in that role for about 2 hours, and his nickname was Bungle, which will give you a sense of what it is. When the acting purser Bungle had set fire to the boss's office by putting a cigarette, an unextinguished cigarette, into a waste paper basket. The office caught fire, there was lots of smoke everywhere throughout the ship, and we all had to sort of crowd into the areas ready to man the lifeboat. Now, you can imagine that he didn't do very well in that particular role and wasn't asked to do it again. And so there, I've got all sorts of tales of the sea that I could regale you with, but I'll move on. I'll move on to the specifics of this lecture. First thing I want to say is, I mean, you've probably all picked up on this so far, but shipwrecks seem to be fascinating. And it seems to be, in another kind of perverse way, acceptable to be fascinated in shipwrecks in a way that we're not allowed to be with other disasters, right? You can buy coffee table books about shipwrecks. I've got one, right? I'm presuming you can't buy coffee table books about airline disasters, house fires, car crashes, right? It would just, it's beyond bad taste, isn't it? So, but shipwrecks are different. Now, specifically, the Titanic is the shipwreck par excellence. Why does it exert such fascination? Not really sure. It's certainly not the worst loss of life at sea. That honour goes to a ship called the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was a German refugee ship escaping from Danzig in 1945 that was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine and sank with a loss of 9,000 to 10,000 lives. Okay? We're not really sure. All those people went into the Baltic in January 1945, so you can imagine how cold and depressing that was. But nevertheless, the Titanic really seems to exert its hold, as John mentioned in the introduction, over us as a metaphor. I mean, what it's really become, its career as a liner was tragically short, but it's gone on and on as a metaphor, hasn't it? That's what it really comes down to us today. And I think that each generation invents the Titanic anew for itself. So if we take some recent ideas, Simon Sharma, historian, has said that the Titanic is a metaphor for global capitalism and the GFC. Okay? That this was something that you could have seen happen, right? You could have seen this coming, but if you hadn't been so reckless, if we hadn't been going so fast, then disaster could be averted. From the other end of the political spectrum, just recently on ABC's The Drum, a commentator from the Institute of Public Affairs here in Australia, Chris Berg, great name I thought for this thing, drew the lesson that this was really a morality tale, and the morality tale he drew was that it was pointless to expect governments to be able to regulate sufficiently, right? And therefore we should just, you know, not expect them to do that, and not even try. Another morality tale, and in quite a different sense, I'm not linking the two in any case, comes from 1943. And I didn't know about this until this week, actually. 1943, Joseph Goebbels commissioned a film called The Titanic, about the Titanic, but about how terrible the English were. Right? This was the propaganda content of the 1943 Titanic. And in a sense, we can add the director of that film to one of the victims of the Titanic. The German director of this film was overheard making derogatory remarks about German naval officers. He was questioned by the Gestapo on the basis of those remarks, and he was found hanged the next morning in his cell. There are other inadvertent victims of the Titanic. One of the first films about the Titanic was made only months after the disaster. It was called Saved from the Titanic, and it starred someone called Dorothy Gibson. And Dorothy Gibson was one of the early stars of cinema in America. So she reenacted for the screen, for the silent screen, her escape from the stricken liner. 1 year later, she was hurtling through New York in her lover's automobile, and she ran over someone and killed him. Right? Another inadvertent victim of the Titanic. So it resonates down and down and down through the ages. But if we're looking at the Titanic as a metaphor for Europe, it's really tempting to sort of see this as Europe steaming towards disaster, hubristically steaming towards disaster, supremely confident, imbued with the idea of progress, but only moments away from something that would change everything, an event that would change everything. And that, of course, was the First World War. But it might be best to take a slightly different approach. And that different approach would be to look at the anatomy of the disaster. You know, what happened, what people thought happened, how they received the news, and see what that reveals about Europe 100 years ago. And of course, because this is a centenary, all centenaries are designed not only to make us think about what happened back then, but also make implicit comparisons about how we are today. So we'll trace that through as we go through the lecture. But I want to start off with a point that might seem obvious, but really is worth making. The Titanic, the RMS Titanic, to give it its full name, the Royal Mail Steamer Titanic, is what is technically known to those people in the trade, like merchant seamen myself, as a ship. Right? That's S-H-I-P for those of you taking notes. Right? Now, you're thinking this really is one of the best universities in the world, isn't it? Right? So, what this is, the point that I'm making here is that although we're on the cusp of a whole new set of communications technologies, I'm thinking here of the automobile. Daimler-Benz came up with the first one in 1885. We've got the Wright brothers flying in 1903. Louis Blériot crosses the Channel in his monoplane in 1909. Ships are still very much the main way of getting around the globe. They are the main means of global transport 100 years ago. And ship technology itself had expanded rapidly in the 20 years before the sinking of the Titanic, which is one reason that regulation had not been able to keep up with the pace of the development. Now, the Titanic, as you would know, was the largest ship in the world at the time. It was the largest movable human-made object. The largest ship in the world because it was 1 foot longer than its sister ship, the Olympic. Right, by 1 foot. I'm not sure what happened. That something went wrong from the designs to the execution. But there was all this growth in technology was fueled in some senses by competition, and this is the first point that I want to make. But I want to do this by pointing out something in particular. The fourth funnel. Now you'll know that the Titanic has this very iconic shape, and it has these very iconic four funnels, okay, buff-coloured funnels in the colours of the White Star Line. That was the company that built it. But it only had 3 engines. I say only, they were massive. They were 4 stories high, these engines, so they were enormous. But nevertheless, if you've only got 3 engines, you only need 3 funnels. Right? So why has it got a 4th one? Well, they managed to find some use for it, even though it was more or less decorative, and it was to get smoke out from the galley. Right? It wasn't particularly there to vent the exhaust from the huge boilers. But the reason that it was added was to keep up with the Germans. The Germans had launched, or were planning to launch, a transatlantic liner called the Imperator. And that had 4 funnels. So that meant that British ships had to have 4 funnels too. Right? Because you couldn't be outdone by the Germans. And this, in a sense, is a reflection of one of the first points I would like to make about Europe 100 years ago, is that it was in the grip of an arms race. In particular, a naval arms race between Britain and Germany. Right? All the other powers had kind of dropped out. Even France had decided not to compete. Because what happened in 1906 was that the British launched a utterly new type of warship. This particular ship was called HMS Dreadnought, and it gave its name to a class of ship known as dreadnoughts. And this had such speed and firepower and armour that it made all other ships obsolete. Okay? So how did other navies respond? Well, there's a financial cost here. It's very expensive to build one of these, let alone 8, which was the British aim in 1906, although they got to 21 in the end. Other navies made calculations. We can't keep up with this. Let's drop out and let's kind of develop other different classes of ships. The Germans took up the challenge. Particularly between 1906 and 1912, there was this Anglo-German naval race, arms race, if you like. Now remember that these are the capital weapons of their day. That is to say, these are the nuclear weapons of 100 years ago. The more you had of these, the more you could project your government's power and authority to all parts of the world. So this is very much tied up with Britain's imperial mission, but also with confrontation in the North Sea between Britain and Germany. And the imperial dimension to this is quite interesting, because in both Britain and Germany, patriotic and imperial leagues sprung up in order to force governments to expend even more on this type of armament. And there was a catchphrase in Britain's case was, "We want 8 and we won't wait." Okay, so you'd have crowds shouting this, "We want 8 and we won't wait." So they would chant this at meetings and so on. And in Germany, similar leagues. But the bit I'm interested in actually is Australia, because the Australian and New Zealand governments knew on which side their bread was buttered. And they felt it was important for them to contribute something towards a dreadnought. And it wasn't just the governments that were keen on doing that, it was patriotic citizens here in Australia too, who started fundraising to buy a dreadnought. Now I'm kind of amused by that, because convert that effort into Freddos. You know those fundraising Freddos that you can get? Like, how many Freddos does it take? How do you have to eat in order to get a dreadnought? Right? The answer is evidently quite a lot, and it was actually beyond the means of the Australian citizenry, those who felt inclined to support such a thing. It was beyond their means. The funds that they had raised, though, had been diverted, or were diverted, into something called the Dreadnought Farm, which was established in Camden, just up the road in New South Wales. So instead of being able to equip the mother country with a ship such as that, it was decided to help the mother country another way, and the Dreadnought Farm was for young boys from the crowded mills and cities of Britain to come out and experience all those things that Britain didn't have. Sunshine, space, meat, all those kind of things. And thereby build up a race of strong young men, right? So that was the idea, and I don't know if the Dreadnought Farm is still there. It'd be interesting to find out. But that's the Australian connection. And the second point to make is focused on land rather than sea. And that is what we would call militarism. 100 years ago, European governments were in a system of alliances that would eventually bring about the conflagration of the First World War, which I'll say a little bit more about later. But in a strategic sense, first of all, German governments, successive German governments, were very aware of where they sat in Europe. Okay? Anyone could look at a map and say, well, we've got France on one side and you've got Russia on the other. That's a problem for Germany, right? That's a problem for Germany. The French were in the grip of a very powerful political lobby who were keen to restore French rule over the so-called lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which had been lost to the German Reich in 1871 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And if you like, this kind of German paranoia about their geostrategic situation, and French what we call revanchism, okay, so just revengism would be a poor translation of that, generated a situation whereby military tension was just under the surface. And we're not talking about professional armies here, we're talking about mass conscript armies. So this kind of service in the armed forces was touching people throughout French European societies. Now that will give you a background to kind of some of the international relations of Europe 100 years ago. But I want to return to the Titanic and start teasing out what we might be able to say about society and international relations if we look at what happened on board. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is survival rates, right? Survival rates of people on the Titanic. And this is split by gender and children, through first, second and third class passengers, which of course I'm taking as a proxy for, if you like, upper class, middle class, working class passengers, and then the crew here. Now you notice I've got no figures for children in the crew. We assume that some of the crew members were in their minority. People went to sea very early, sort of 14, 15, but they weren't calculated that way. But what you see here is, or are, figures that gave the lie to the notion of women and children first. I mean, this is one of the strong ideas about the Titanic that came through in early reports of the ship's demise, but also were quickly countered when the breakdown of the figures was published in one of two inquiries that was held. One was held in the United States, only weeks after the disaster. The other was held months after the disaster back in London, when the survivors were able to come back to London. And these figures came out, and these figures are quite interesting. You'll notice that it is true that more women survived than men. That's true. Although when we look at the female figures for crew, there were only 20 women out of a crew of about 800. There were strong superstitions about women working at sea. You know, it was bad enough if you had to have them as passengers, but to have them working was a big no-no. So there were only 20 women and 17 survived. The crew, of course, some of whom would be allocated to the lifeboats, seemed to fare better than second and third class men. But the thing that worried people first of all was that 37% of first class men survived. 97% of women survived, and the 3% who didn't were often those who refused to leave their husbands. But this figure of 37% stands out when you compare it to the second and third class. In fact, it's almost double then put together. And so there starts to be a critique of the upper classes, which I'll come to in a minute. But the figure that I want to dwell on here in the first place is the second-class male. Second-class male, and this is one of those sort of what would I do moment, because I identified myself as a second-class male, right? I kind of think I'm middle class. I know I'm not an aristocrat. I don't think I'm working class. So I kind of imagine that I'd be one of those group of men that would stand only an 8% chance of surviving, which kind of depresses me, right? And here I think, well, look, this is a group of people, because I should say there are structural reasons. This is all about ideology. There are structural reasons. First class passengers had all their cabins on the upper deck, and you know if a ship goes down, you want to be on the upper deck, right? Third class passengers in steerage at the stern, down below the waterline, very difficult to get out. Second class is a bit different. And I can't help but think there's something about the behaviour here of second-class males that suggests something about their behaviour in the trenches in the First World War II. We know that this class of men suffered a disproportionate losses as they, in the British Army anyway, as they sought to lead their men, their working-class troops, over the top. This is the so-called lost generation. The Rupert Graves, the Wilfred Owens, and of course by 1918 it's Wilfred Owen who's sardonically writing, dulce et decorum est pro patria more. But I think the idea is that these values have been adopted by middle class men more than any other group. How can we test this? Well, luckily for us, not for the passengers, there was another ship that sunk very much like the Titanic, this time in 1915, called the Lusitania. Now the Lusitania was a Cunard liner. It was sailing from the United States to Britain, and it was just off the coast of Ireland when a German submarine, a German U-boat, torpedoed it and sank it. The Germans had just declared that they would pursue a war of unrestricted submarine warfare. That is to say, they would sink anything that was British and that came well, anything that was British was fair game. And that meant passenger liners too. Now, there was some controversy about whether it was a troop ship and so on and so forth, but you can see that the Germans initially thought this was a great sort of victory at sea, and they had this, these sort of commemorative postcards printed, and that's the von Tirpitz, the head of the German Navy, and this was seen to be great. But it was a propaganda disaster, particularly in the United States, because a lot of US citizens died in this particular tragedy. But for our purposes here, well, it's not a tragedy, it was an act of war. For our purposes here, what we're interested in is comparing the rates of time that it took the Lusitania and the Titanic to sink. The Titanic struck an iceberg at 1140, and it sunk sometime between 2:20 and 2:30. So almost 3 hours. Almost 3 hours for the Titanic to sink. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. And when you compare the survival rates, again by class and gender, there's nothing really in it. We know that actually you're more likely to survive on the Lusitania if you're aged between 16 and 35, which again depresses me, because I'm 36. So we can kind of infer from that the long and slow and until the very end unpanicked situation that the Titanic found itself in allowed more time for those kind of social norms and mores to establish themselves on the decks of the Titanic, and so how we start to get some of this differentiation between survival rates based on class of ticket. Now, where did this idea of women and children first come from then? Well, another shipwreck for you, this time of a ship called HMS Birkenhead. And the Birkenhead was a British troop ship that sank off the coast of South Africa in 1852. 1852. And though it was a troop ship, it was also carrying migrants. So the troops were off to fight in something called the Frontier War in the Cape Colony that ran throughout the 1850s. When it foundered on a reef, no ships had enough lifeboats for anyone before the Titanic, had enough lifeboats for everyone before the Titanic disaster and the inquest thereafter. So it was clear that not everyone was going to survive. So what the officers did were get the men and the officers to stand in parade ground formation on the deck of the ship as it sank. Now all the women and children were saved and the soldiers went down with the ship. Now this became an enormously famous incident. This is a painting commissioned in the 1930s of the incident, so you can see it's still resonating even then. It had an effect on Prussian militarism too. Prussian regiments were read out the story of the Birkenhead and said, they were told this is the kind of discipline that you should emulate, Prussians, you know. So this is the kind of the foundational idea of women and children first. And there's a script. What it did, if you like, was establish a script that for particularly male behaviour, well, female behaviour too, I mean, they had to acquiesce and leave, but particularly male behaviour of how to comport oneself in the face of this type of threat, this type of imminent demise. There's also another interesting quote, which again, of course, may be apocryphal, but the importance here is that it was believed and that the message was conveyed, is that the captain of the Titanic, as the ship started to go down, shouted to his crew, "Be British, boys." All right? Be British. Now I'm just interested, like, if someone told British people today to be British, what would they do? You can fill in the blanks, I'm sure, right? But the point is that I think that there was a stronger accepted sense of what it meant to be British then, or at least how people expected British people to behave in the face of adversity. And this is all about kind of, if you like, the theme running through here is honour and dishonour. And so we get to one of the villains, if you like, of the Titanic sinking, and that is the owner of White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, J. Bruce Ismay. And he did that most ignoble of things, survived. He survived. And many people at the time thought, well, he, of all people, should have been, you know, going down with the ship. But no, he found his way to a lifeboat. Another person upon whom dishonour was heaped was the captain of another ship that was in the vicinity of the Titanic as it sank, called the Californian. Now, when the Titanic was, the Californian and the Titanic were passing each other. And the Californian was the ship that radioed the Titanic. This is another new technological innovation, the Marconi wireless. Using the Marconi wireless, the Californian radioed the Titanic, said there's lots of ice around here. Beware. The Titanic radioed back and said, keep out. Right? Keep out was a signal to say, we're doing something else, don't bother us. So the radio operator on the California went to bed. Now, the idea is that the Titanic struck the iceberg. Eventually it sent up some flares, but distress flares were no different colour from any other flares. You couldn't differentiate them. And in one film from the 1950s, A Night to Remember, we have the crew on the California sort of saying, well, oh, looks like they're having a party. They must be having fireworks. There's a lot of it seems that the California was a scapegoat, because the captain of the California always maintained he was further away than other people reckoned he was, and he couldn't have done anything really to save the Titanic. He couldn't have got there in time. And he always maintained that. No one believed him until they found the Titanic at the bottom of the sea in 1986 and realised it was 13 miles further west than everyone had thought. And so actually it probably was true. He couldn't have got it. But he spent the rest of his career defending his own honour. Defending his own honour, because it was seen to be a cowardly act. But it is the case, though, that there was another ship that was close by. And it was not the Californian that was the ship, the so-called ship that stood still, but a Canadian ship called the Mount Temple, which, when it appeared that it was approaching the Titanic and the ice was there, it stopped. But it not only stopped, it turned off all its lights so it couldn't be seen. And the crew on the Mount Temple were incensed at their captain about this, but felt that they had to keep quiet about it. They did supply some evidence to the two inquests, but that evidence was not submitted. It was decided not to submit that evidence, and the Californian wore the cost of the ignominy. So there's some of the villains of the piece, but the real hero, of course, is Wallace Hartley. Now, Wallace Hartley was the bandmaster on the Titanic. Now, in those figures I showed you, they're included in the crew, but the 8 members of the Titanic band were in a difficult situation on the night of 15th of April 2012, because they were neither crew nor passengers. They were contractors, right? So it wasn't clear whether they would have to stay on board or whether they were entitled to space on the lifeboat just as other passengers were. As it turned out, they made a decision to stay on board. And many reports from the subsequent inquest do point to or suggest that music was being played at various stages in the 3 hours of the sinking. And first of all, it seems that they were playing what were called rag tunes or ragtimes. I mean, this was sort of popular music of its day. And the idea there was a sort of a divertisement. It was uplifting, upbeat music, you know, try and keep people to stop from panicking. The crew were a bit worried that the steerage class people would panic. But as things got worse and worse and worse, the music got more contemplative, if you like, until finally we get to the idea that the last song that was played on the Titanic was one called Nearer My God to Thee. Now that piece of music that you heard at the beginning was called Nearer My God to Thee. But the difficulty is that there are 3 versions of Nearer My God to Thee, right? Depending on which denomination you were and which country you're from. It was originally, the words were originally written in the 1850s in north of England by a Unitarian. It became popular in America, across the Atlantic, during the Civil War, and was particularly adopted by American Episcopalians. And then it became associated with English nonconformity back in the north of England again. And this is where Hartley comes in. Hartley was from a Lancashire town called Colne, where nonconformity was a very strong part of civic life. This image here is of his funeral, which was attended by 40,000 people in May, once his body had been recovered in May 1912. But there's a lot of confusion about whether it was this song that was played, which version of this song was played, or was it something else? Because other reports say it was a song called Autumn, or other various hymns. And it all came down to a reported conversation between Hartley and one of his friends, who said, and this is sort of sounds a bit too close to be true, if I were on a sinking ship, do you know, I'd play Nearer My God to Thee. Right? There's that, and then of course there's James Cameron. We got to a stage in reading around this, in this subject, where almost no one believed anymore by about the mid-1990s that Nearer My God to Thee was the tune played as the ship went down. However, Cameron decided it was indeed Nearer My God to Thee, and it was the version that we heard, which I think is the Episcopalian one, and that's how we've got that. That's where we're at now. Very strong associations there. All this points to, if you look at the scale of the interest in Hartley, all this points to how important it was at the time. As John said, sort of one of those epochal moments. And there were, of course, though, differing views. I think one thing that gets lost when we get to centenary is the notion of dissenting views. Dissenting views. And now we're all kind of... the way that the centenary of the sinking is presented to us is about the shock that people felt, which is true. There was shock. There was shock. But on the other hand, there were people who felt that this was all just kind of made up. One of them was G.B. Shaw. Now, G.B. Shaw was famous for being controversial, of course, but nevertheless, he was the one to point out, he said that how come whenever there's a disaster, we have this kind of hysterical need for heroes, and we'll just pick a hero, we'll make up a whole load of stuff about him, and it doesn't matter if it's true or not, but it actually helps us. Now, that's kind of familiar to kind of constructivist historiography, if you like, but at the time it was a little bit shocking. Someone who didn't agree with him was Arthur Conan Doyle, right, the man who wrote Sherlock Holmes. And he thought that this, in the incident of the band, and Hartley's example in particular, kind of proved everything that was great about the British character and the British Empire. So even at the time, we've got different views there. But it said a lot about men. The other thing, the other context that the Titanic sinking is taking place in is first wave feminism. It is the campaign for suffrage. Now, of course, in Australia and New Zealand, women had got the vote in 1893 and 1901, respectively. In Britain, in France and Germany, women did not have the vote. And in Britain in particular, there was an intense campaign that sought to gain the vote for women. Now, first of all, the stories that were coming out of the Titanic suggested that there was a kind of a new model of womanhood possible. And two women in particular were singled out for praise. The first was Molly Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown there in the large hat, and inset the more demure-looking Countess of Rothes, both of whom tillered one of the lifeboats, and the Countess of Rothes cared for and gave solace to some of the bereaved people in the lifeboat themselves. So kind of still in the kind of tender, caring mode, but also in a much more kind of a leadership mode. Now this is kind of problematic because in the one sense you want to suggest that this is a good thing, that women started playing these roles. On the other hand, it's a little bit unsettling. Now, for Molly Brown, it's not too difficult because she was that most vulgar of things, an American, and was therefore a little bit outside the sort of the bounds of behaviour expected by British men of women. But the Countess of Rothes, as you can see, it's slightly more demure looking there, was not. Okay, but again, you could sort of say, well, okay, what lessons can we draw from the Titanic and the sinking of the Titanic about women's suffrage? Because immediately people seized on this idea and said, look, the Titanic proves women don't need the vote. Right? Women don't need the vote because the men truly do have their interests at heart. You know, what greater evidence do you need that they will listen to you if you write it down in a letter and will vote on your behalf. So, of course, people are drawing different conclusions from the evidence that they are being presented. But here again is another issue. Countess of Rothes, she is an aristocrat. She is an aristocrat. And one of the things that we pick up on, again, in the telling of the Titanic story, are class tensions. Okay, we've already looked at the higher rates of survival of first-class ticket holders. And very quickly rumours spread, although later disproved, but again we're interested in the fact that they do spread, is that a couple of aristocrats, Lord and Lady Duff Gordon, had hired their own lifeboat. They'd hired their own lifeboat. They had paid the crew to row them away as quickly as possible with them and their friends and their entourage on. Because most of the lifeboats weren't full. That was another one of the problems. I mean, there weren't seats for everyone, but most of the lifeboats weren't full. And this, in a sense, is a critique of the upper, that is to say, the ruling class at the time. It's a critique. And it says that these people are not as born to rule as they keep telling us that they are. And the anxiety that goes there mirrors the actions of some of the officers on board. They're worried about panic from the steerage class. In other words, they're worried about pressure coming up from the lower social orders. And what we see, of course, is the development, particularly in Western Europe, more so than Eastern Europe, of a mass industrial working class. Okay? Britain had become the first society to have more people living in towns and cities than in the countryside in 1851. And places like Germany, France, Belgium were not far behind them. And Wallace Hartley, of course, came from this type of environment, this type of industrial environment, and these of course would be the people who would fill the ranks of the armies of the Great War once fighting broke out in 2 years' time. But more concerning than that, in terms of the class tensions, was the concomitant development of organised labour, socialist movements, or indeed communist movements. And we are, of course, in 1912, only 5 years, only 5 years out from the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik takeover. So you can see that these class tensions are not just kind of sniping, if you like, but there's very real political danger involved in them. And at the time, organised labour was organised internationally into something called the Second International. And the Second International was a confederation of socialist organisations in countries throughout Europe and North America. And the idea was, particularly for the European members of the Second International, is that on the outbreak of war, they would not declare their support for the regime and the opposing regimes of each of the governments, but rather they would declare a strike, the so-called general strike. And in the general strike, particularly of the transport workers, ships, railwaymen, so on and so forth, would actually prevent the armies being able to meet each other and therefore to fight each other. And that strike would prevent war. And a lot of hopes were placed in this strike, this idea of the strike. But the problem was that the Second International was far too national. It was more national than international. And it was organised, as I mentioned, on these national bases. It was a confederation. And particularly the German Social Democratic Party, the largest socialist organisation in 1914, when war broke out, immediately supported the German government. The Second International was collapsing. And one of the leading lights of the Second International, the French socialist leader Jean Jaurès, was assassinated on the 31st of July 1914. And between these two events, it seemed that organised socialism could not compete with the power of nationalism. And that, of course, is one of the major political forces of Europe 100 years ago. When we think about the Titanic, remember that it was built in Belfast, and the last place it landed was in Cork, or Queenstown, in the south of Ireland. Then we'll realise that just looking at Ireland itself gives you an expression of, or gives you an indication of the wider importance of nationalism in Europe. Now, Ireland was on the verge of a civil war that was ironically only postponed by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. But here again, you've got a strong tension. But when it comes to 1914, we again return to this notion of duty, and we see middle-class people, particularly across Europe, reflecting that call to duty, reflecting that sense of doing what they think is right. Middle-class people like Adolf Hitler, who you can see inset in that photograph, who here was photographed by accident and only discovered by an assiduous researcher later on, celebrating the outbreak of war in Munich, although he was Austrian. I always think the Austrians have started 2 world wars, but I've managed to blame the Germans for it both times. Anyway, that's him. Sorry if there are any Austrians in the audience. So here we are moving east, again in Austria. And of course, if we're looking for someone who, if you like, fired the first shot of the Great War, then we have a candidate. We have a candidate. And it's Gavrilo Princip. And Princip was a Bosnian Serb, a member of the secret organisation called the Black Hand, who wanted the Bosnian part the Serbian part of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which had been annexed by Austria-Hungary into the empire in 1908, to be returned, as he saw it, returned to Serbia. And this radical form of nationalism was imbued with a kind of an anarchist notion that one dramatic deed would be enough to spark off a wider uprising. And so he and fellow conspirators decided to test this proposition because they knew that Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, was visiting Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. There were 4 other conspirators along with Princip. The assassination attempt was bungled. At one stage, one of the co-conspirators threw a bomb under the Archduke's car, and the Archduke decided to abandon the trip, to abandon the visit. So he the car went to turn around, and it got blocked in a dead end, down an alley, where Gavrilo Princip, who was going home because he'd never seen the car, because it wasn't where he thought it was going to be, ran onto the running board, got out his revolver and shot both Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. And this sparked a train of events, which I will skirt over very briefly for you, that set the Great War into motion. Princip shot Ferdinand. The Austrians demanded that Serbia meet some unmeetable demands. They invaded Serbia. Russia decided to mobilise against Austria, but they weren't sophisticated enough to mobilise just against Austria. They had to mobilise against everyone, which meant mobilising against Germany. Germany had this brilliant plan that if Russia mobilised against it, it would immediately attack France. But it would do so through Belgium. And when the Germans had invaded Belgium, that brought Britain into the war, and so within 6 weeks, everyone in Europe is at war, except for the Italians. But they join later. So what you've got is a conflagration there, which if you look at the inset, the real key crux here is the so-called Schlieffen Plan. the Schlieffen Plan. Because that German plan, I go back to this point about German insecurity. You look at the map there, what are they going to do about the Russians and the French in the east and the west? Well, they take a calculated risk. They say the Russian railway network is not as sophisticated and is more extended than the French one. Therefore, the Russians will not be able to invade eastern Prussia as quickly as the French will be able to get to the Rhine. Therefore, we'll knock the French out first by swinging through Belgium, encircling Paris, and then we'll head east and sort out the Russians. They almost did that. But they didn't go via Paris. They left their flank open. The French were able to rush enforcements in taxis and buses and all sorts of things up to the Marne, defeated the Germans on the Marne, and pushed them back to almost to the border, where we got that kind of trench warfare stabilised by the end of 1914. Now, the Germans were able to defeat the Russians, but not knock them out. So in according blame here, because blame is very important, I have something that I call the Eurovision War Contest. And I've got this here. I do give Germany 10 points for the Schlieffen Plan. I think that was needless escalation. Well, France, well, yes, La Revanche that I mentioned before, that also escalated political tensions. And the British were never really clear enough. They were always a bit sort of diffident when it came to being allies. You know, they didn't have alliances, they had ententes. Right? So if they said clearer, you know, we will go to war with you, Germany, if you invade Belgium, because this was always a surprise to the Germans, then they might have done something else. The Russian Empire was too archaic and inflexible. Austria-Hungary was too harsh, that's 7 points. Serbia gets 4 points. But really, Dou's point for me goes to the alliance system and the arms race. Okay? That without those factors, we really wouldn't be in the situation that we were today. So, last couple of things to say. First of all, hubris and technology. Hubris and technology is... Here's the metaphor, isn't it? Is that the Titanic was unsinkable. The Titanic was unsinkable, and technology was advancing too far beyond human control. Right? As Mary Habeck has put it, what we see in this sort of technology at this particular time, in relation to the Great War, was a war in which machines developed much more rapidly than the minds of the men controlling them. Okay, so it's almost like that the machines are taking over, and you can see that reflected in science fiction like H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, published in 1899. But also, there's more prosaic concerns, that it's not really just this kind of sort of a tragedy of men versus machines, but it's more human failings. Take the Mersey report. Okay, one of the inquiries that I'm getting a lot of this information from. Okay, this was an inquiry into what was called the Board of Trade, that is to say, the government department that was responsible for marine transport. And one of the things that they were looking at was the question of whether, well, you know, should there be lifeboats for everyone? What kind of role does government have over? What kind of authority does it have over businesses and companies to regulate safety of citizens and so on? The inquiry into the Board of Trade, in a twist worthy of Sir Humphrey, was carried out by, you guessed it, the Board of Trade. Right? So, unsurprisingly, the Board of Trade got off quite lightly in terms of this disaster, and that is why the Californian, we suspect, was labelled as the scapegoat, far more than the Mount Temple. You'll remember that Canadian ship that I was mentioned before. And in one report, McLean and Jones questioned the scapegoating of the Californian and the ignoring of the Mount Temple, and asked, could it be that nobody hated the Canadians? So, we're on to representations. Now, as I said, each generation begins anew. Here we have Goebbels, Titanic, up inset as well, posters for one of the films that gets forgotten, and my favourite, is Raise the Titanic, from either 80 or 84, I can't remember. What's interesting about this is that even in the early 1980s, it wasn't assumed that the Titanic had split in half. Right? Because to raise the whole thing, you know, it's got to be intact. Early on in the piece, there were plans suggested that you could actually raise the Titanic by inserting one of these new gadgets that were all the rage, ping pong balls. If you inserted enough ping pong balls into the wreck, it would just pop up. This wasn't right. And Raise the Titanic itself was such an expensive flop as a film that someone quipped once that, you know, it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic. But this brings us to, of course, more recent concerns. Now, when the Costa Concordia capsized only earlier this year, it was interesting. Some of the reports that I saw from survivors who were obviously shocked, but it was just interesting. They said it was just like the Titanic. And I thought, well, how did they know? And of course, because they'd seen the film. And so again, we're more up to date. And it's been re-released in 3D, hasn't it? So I think that's interesting, not just because it's a centenary. Centenaries are occasions to do all these kind of things, but they're money-making issues as well. They're money-making instances too. Imagine an infant girl born on the day that the Titanic was first released in 1997, right? Today she'd be 15. And that is just the perfect audience for a re-release of the Titanic, which of course was aimed very much through a strong female character and the handsome male lead at teenage girls. And I'd like to give you just an example here of how that has translated, how the story of the Titanic has translated to the modern era. Now there may be an advert.
Gentlemen,
let's have a look. It is hard being a teenager, isn't it? But anyway, there we are. So, last thing to say is in 1999 that there was another, before we go to questions, I don't know if we have time for a few questions, I think, but in 1999 there was another sinking. This is the Sun Vista that caught fire in the Straits of Malacca and had to be abandoned. And during this time in the lifeboats, one Australian survivor recounted on his return that some people started singing. And you know what it was. That's right, it was My Heart Will Go On. And I tell you, if that's not enough to make you want to leap right out of the lifeboat and into the water, I don't know what is. So before I sum up, I think there are a little time for questions before we go to our last bit. I don't know if Catherine, do you want to, shall I just take questions from the floor if there are any? Okay, all right, we'll go here, yeah.
I'm just really interested in the whole story about Capitalism and the Californian, because there does seem to be two very disparate views still existing about his culpability in the situation. And I think, was it you on the radio on Monday morning?
Not on Monday, I don't think, no.
Okay. There was two people interviewed on Monday morning, and one of them was a lawyer who still firmly believes that the Californian could have got there in time and saved. He's writing a whole book about it.
Right.
And yet I've read another book where it firmly believes the Californian was, totally exonerated when they found where the Titanic actually was and all that sort of stuff, and that there was another ship. And
well, what I've learned, this is a question about the California and whether it could have saved people from the Titanic or not. And what I've learned from just researching this and reading about this is there are so many conflicting reports, and people are so keen to read into it what they will, that there is a caution. We need to slow ahead. When we hear about any of these competing claims, because it would be hard to say, and the information that we've got, maybe from the Board of Trade inquiries, has not been submitted, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to say. Yeah, you never know, but you'd have to read it and weigh it up. But I'll take one more maybe before. Yeah.
And one of the things that I was really interested in is the idea of the loss of a significant proportion of one group of people, and that happened both in the First World War and in the sinking of the Titanic, in that the crew, a lot of them came from Southampton, and whole streets of people. Both the father and the mother may have been on the ship, but probably more likely the father. Just lost due to the crew going down with the ship, but also then in the First World War, the whole towns of men were signed up as a battalion from the one town, and then going over the top.
Yeah.
So there's more symbolism, and there's also that interaction of the class stuff that you were talking about.
The so-called chums or pals battalions. Again, people were joined up with their friends deliberately to sort of get them to join up in the first place and to help them integrate into army life and so on. So that's a good analogy to make. And I think that communities were more integrated now. Again, if you think about a street now, most people sort of drive out of their street and you may not know your neighbours or something, but that wasn't the case when people didn't have cars and weren't were more grounded in their locality. And these losses were felt very, very gravely, weren't they, in those particular ways. Yeah. All right. Now I'm sensing that people want to go, so I just have to do one little bit of summing up, and that is to say, really reiterate the point that I made in response to the question just there, was that basically we must proceed with caution. We must not rush like the Titanic into judgments, because the issue is so vexed and so clouded with people reading into it what they will, that we must be very cautious with all our sources of information.